Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving straight into Gamze Aaron's comprehensive legal analysis of the massive 2019 overhaul to the Austrian social insurance system. We're going to be unpacking the sheer scale of how this administrative backbone was totally rewired. And trust me, we also need to talk about the intense constitutional shockwaves those changes created. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start by defining what social self-governance actually is. Then, we'll look at the Great Fund merger, the new umbrella organization, the brand new parity in the governing bodies, and finally, the constitutional limits.
All right, Section 1. What is social Self-Verwaltung? What is social self-governance?
So, the absolute bedrock of this entire system is Selbstverwaltung, or self-governance. It's actually baked right into Article 120A of the Austrian Constitution, and it allows the insured population to independently manage their own public tasks. Basically, this means they are totally free from direct day-to-day instructions from the state government. It's a really unique exception to your standard state bureaucracy, and it's specifically designed to ensure decentralization and direct democratic participation for citizens in matters that affect their daily lives, things like health and pensions. Structurally speaking, these self-governing entities share a few non-negotiable features. First off, they are public corporate bodies operating on mandatory membership. So if you work, you are automatically in by law, no exceptions. They also require the democratic selection of their governing organs, meaning they're run by actual representatives of the members, not just state-appointed bureaucrats. On top of that, they have financial autonomy. They're primarily funded by member contributions rather than just state taxes. And finally, while they are highly independent, they aren't going rogue. They're subject to strict state oversight, just to ensure they're following the law. Moving on to Section 2, the Grosse Kassenfusion, the Great Fund merger. This is where the theory actually hits the ground. To really understand this, picture the system before 2019. It was kind of this massive, complex pyramid. Austria had 21 separate social insurance carriers. You had 9 regional health insurance funds, literally one for every single federal state, plus 5 company-specific health insurance funds, alongside all these various pension and accident insurance bodies. It was highly decentralized, incredibly fragmented, and it had just grown organically over decades. Then, the reform hit. It completely replaced that sprawling pyramid with a super streamlined structure of just 5 carriers. We are talking about a monumental administrative overhaul of the country's entire social safety net. That is a drop from 21 carriers down to just 5. The government's main goal here was to cut administrative waste, harmonize benefits across the board, and ultimately create a more efficient system. But you might be wondering, how exactly do you squeeze 21 massive bureaucratic entities into just 5? Well, let's break down exactly where everyone went. The 9 regional health funds, the Gebietskrankenkassen, were completely fused into one giant national entity, the Österreichische Gesundheitskasse, or OGK for short. The 5 company health funds, they were either absorbed into the OGK or turned into internal company facilities. Meanwhile, the funds for the self-employed and farmers merged into the SVS, and the funds for railway workers, miners, and public servants combined to form the BVAEB. It is honestly a masterclass in bureaucratic consolidation, neatly organized into a few massive pillars. Section 3. The new slim umbrella organization. Under the old setup, the overarching umbrella organization at the top was called the Hauptverband, and its executive board had 12 voting members representing various labor and economic chambers. While the reform replaced this with a new, much leaner Dachverband, the leadership size was actually reduced to a conference of just 10 voting members, and these 10 members consist exclusively of the chairpersons of the 5 new insurance carriers and their deputies. But it wasn't just a simple change in headcount. The new Dachverband operates with fundamentally shifted competencies. While the old Hauptverband had some pretty significant power to issue binding guidelines, the reform reduced these guideline competencies, which effectively pushed a lot more operational power down to the individual carriers, like the OJK. At the same time, the Dachverband's role became heavily focused on centralization, specifically coordinating centralized IT and administrative services to reduce the overall bureaucratic footprint. So basically, less top-down policy dictation and a lot more back-office efficiency. Section 4. Der neue Parität der Gremien. The new parity. You see, the reform didn't just merge carriers on the outside. It completely flattened their internal administrative structures, too. The old system had this really complex 3-tier setup with a general assembly, a management board, and a control assembly. The reform swept all of that away, replacing it primarily with a single, powerful Verwaltungsrat, or administrative council for these new mega carriers. And here is the absolutely crucial part. For the massive OGK and the pension fund, the reform introduced a strict 50-50 parity on this new council. Exactly 50% of the seats go to employee representatives and 50% go to employers. Historically, representation was proportional to who paid the most into the system, which generally meant employee representatives held a significant majority. So, forcing this strict equal split, that was a massive, fundamental shift in the whole power dynamic. And to really lock in this strict parity, they introduced a half-year rotation principle for the chairmanship. Literally every 6 months, the chairperson of the council rotates between an employer representative and an employee representative. This ensures that neither side ever holds the structural upper hand for more than a few months at a time. It is perfectly symmetrical on paper.
Which brings us to Section 5, verfassungsrechtliche Grenzen, or constitutional limits. Because while this perfectly symmetrical system might look fantastic on an organizational chart, it creates some massive friction with the Austrian constitution.
We have to pose the central constitutional question that legal scholars have been wrestling with, neutrally of course. Does this strict 50-50 parity violate the democratic principle? Remember, one of the absolute core tenets of self-governance is the democratic selection of organs. But what does democratic actually mean in a system where the two groups being represented are drastically different in size? Let's walk through the compounding factors that lead scholars to question the democratic legitimacy of this new structure. First, the representatives aren't elected directly by the people. They're sent indirectly via the economic and labor chambers. Second, the reform drastically shrunk the size of these administrative bodies, meaning there are just fewer voices in the room overall. And third, the critical blow, enforcing a 50-50 parity regardless of actual population size. There are literally millions of employees in Austria, and only a fraction of that number in employers. Giving them exactly equal voting power fundamentally skews the weight of an individual citizen's representation. As the legal analysis highlights, all these compounding factors lead to what is called a starke Verdünnung der demokratischen Legitimation, a strong dilution of democratic legitimation. The main argument here is that while indirect elections were historically tolerated by the Constitutional Court, combining them with smaller boards and an artificial 50-50 parity that completely ignores the actual makeup of the insured population, well, that might finally stretch constitutional tolerance right past its breaking point. Ultimately, it boils down to a classic clash of legal philosophies. On one side, you have the constitutional principle of democratic representation, which suggests governing bodies should roughly reflect the actual proportions of the people they govern. On the other side, you have the reform's explicit choice of strict parity, which prioritizes absolute equality between two structural economic groups, regardless of how many individual humans actually make up those groups. Which leaves us with this really provocative final question. Where exactly is the constitutional limit for organizational efficiency? I mean, a government obviously has a valid interest in saving money and creating a clean, balanced organizational chart. But at what point does top-down engineering hollow out the constitutional right of citizens to democratically govern their own social affairs? It's a fascinating balancing act between state reform and constitutional law, and it is for sure going to continue sparking debate. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.